welcome Nad Muntaz. He's the VP of Compliance within core data for the past 20 years in the pharmaceutical industries. Basically, he's leading the Strugo Transparency Directive programs in the US and European markets. And he has served many positions, including life science practice leaders at SAP, president of the EMC Consulting. So he was also former IT directors with Notsuka, Eisai, Wyatt, and Qingdao. Please welcome Ned.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you.
So thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the numbers that we have seen and heard talked about since the morning. By the way of my background, my name is Nad Muntaz. I'm the practice leader at Core Data. And what I want to do is present to you some of these numbers and expose some of the details that these numbers begin to show as you start to evaluate and analyze them. And I do have a request of you, right? So in order to make this session more interesting, I need some encouragement. And so as I have added a few certain jokes in my presentation, if you would be so kind to appear amused, that'll be helpful. That'll keep me motivated, that'll keep me energized. But more seriously, my colleague, I was asking them, how do you want me to present these numbers to make them more interesting? And they had an idea. Their idea was that I should represent some of the deep analytics the organization has done. And part of that is based on the branding we have provided in analytics, both in US and in Europe. And that branding is represented by this color purple. So their idea was that I should represent the company, wear purple, I did that. Their second idea was to use very few content slides. So not use too many words. So that's what I'll try to do. And the third idea was to make it lighthearted. Right? So that was their suggestion. And this was my read of their suggestion. So what they want me to do is wear funny clothing, not use any presentation aids, and then make these senior compliance officers enjoy a presentation on numbers. I felt that was not a fair ask. Because I'll share very candidly my experience with the compliance team. I was working with a marketing department, assembling some detailed numbers, and as part of that, I was asked to go and get support from the compliance team. So I set up an appointment, went to see the compliance officer, and this was for a major pharma in US. And I started to share that I'm working on a marketing project. I'm looking for help from compliance, and she looked at me, she gave that request an attention, and before I could ask the question, she said to me, the answer is no, but I'll still listen to your question. Fortunately, she did bring a lot of levity to her role, and she wasn't serious about it, and we had a good project. So my experience is that compliance officers have very important and responsible role to play in the organization. The nature of their role requires them to be serious. And so what I'll do is I'll present a very serious analysis of these numbers, but I'll also try to provide you some insights that these show. What I want to also do is set the stage that I'll cover three aspects of the numbers across EFPIA. One at the EU level, second at a specific country level, and third at the company level. And I'll try to see if I can tease out the insights that those data sets offer to us from the 2015 data. One aspect about the numbers and the measurement, by the way of training, I'm a finance professional with also a data science background. So I do believe a lot in numbers. And from a management standpoint, what I want to call out are these two quotations. First one is from Peter Drucker, a well-known expert in management, whose view is that if you really can't measure it, you can't manage it. The second one is from a colleague of mine from Pfizer, who was focused in executive analytics, and he actually ended up writing this book. And the main focus was measuring what matters and managing what can be measured. And so I'll also try to weave in some of these aspects, some of these concepts, that in order for you to manage your spend, your ability to measure it and view it is very important. Agenda. So I'll share some of the number summaries, what these numbers are telling us, the 3 case studies I talked about, and then some business and compliance considerations I would like to share that I feel would help as you look at 16 and beyond. So summary of numbers from 2015. You've heard this. This is old news, but I'll still, for the sake of completeness, briefly share this with you. That as the 2016 numbers were published in June, so 3 months ago, the press has come back and they have basically questioned the rate of consent received from physicians. And this is fairly consistent, fairly across the board. Recently, a couple of months ago in Washington, there was also a similar session on compliance, and there was representation from EFPIA leadership where they expressed the same concern going forward. And we also heard that in Spain, as the consent numbers were fairly low, there is now legislation that's coming in. So that remains consistent. And then I'll also present you numbers around the consent at the national level to further support this concern. This is from a publication that, actually a presentation that was shared by EFPIA. This is a quick graph on the percentage of consent by country. What I want to do is draw your attention to 2 of the numbers. One for Italy, around 65%, and the second one for Germany, around 35%. I'll come back to this. But again, this continues to elaborate the point that there's quite a bit of variability, and then I'll share how this variability affects what some of the specific countrywide analytics begin to show. So in terms of the summary, the national, in this case it was Financial Times in UK, reported that the consent rate is around 70%. In Germany, Der Spiegel reported that the consent rate is around 30%. These numbers are quite accurate. We've done our own analysis. These numbers match up. But we do feel that if you apply a slightly different paradigm to evaluate the numbers, and we heard that during the keynote this morning, that these percentages are meaningful if you take just the volume of physicians who have consented versus those who have not. But the moment you apply a different viewpoint, and that viewpoint, in my judgment, is the euro value of spend for those who have consented and those who have not, these percentages drop quite significantly. And I'll leave it to your judgment what's a better measure, but as an organization, you may want to consider to apply both so that you have clarity on what optics industry might have on the levels of consent within your organization and within your region. And I'll try to share some of those with you. So I think I mentioned that already. One key point is that also what I'll demonstrate is that sometimes the averages and generalizations are convenient, but they may not reveal the true nature of spend, and I'll provide some of those insights as I share these numbers. So for the EU-wide analytics, to make it easy for sharing at this forum, what I did was I limited the data set to 4 countries. No specific reason, just convenience. So I picked Germany, Spain, Italy, and UK. And what I'll share with you is that at the national level, the ratios and spend priorities begin to tell a very different story as you start to look at various other aspects of spend. So rather than talking about it, let me actually show you. And I don't expect you to read it, I can't read it, but all I'm trying to show you is this chart, and that's what's important. And what this chart represents is that as far as the total spend is concerned, the largest share of spend out of these 4 countries is represented by Germany, which is around 35%, or 576 million euros for 2015. And that's consistent with many other numbers that we have seen. But I apply a different focus And I asked the second question, and that question was around donations and grants. As you look at that, the numbers and the percentage changed significantly, and UK comes on top with around 25 million, whereas Germany has the lowest spend, around 8 million. So some might wonder if with the largest spend, pharmaceutical manufacturers in Germany have been very generous or not, but I'll leave that judgment to you. However, what this is showing is that as you evaluate your own organization by country and compare your spend against the industry, there is a different focus that you want to consider by looking at the country level data against your internal data. Something to consider. Right? Similarly, I applied a different lens, which is around fees. And what happens is Spain comes out on top with almost 3/4 share of the total spend. Right? So I'm assuming you knew it, and if you didn't, I'm assuming you are a little bit of surprised by that fact, which you may not have expected. And then there is some corollary to it, right? So, and that corollary is that Spain had the highest spend, around 300 million, and we also know that Spain had the lowest consent. Is there a correlation? Is there a possible correlation that because the fees received by the physicians in Spain is so extraordinarily higher than the rest of the countries, could that have been a motivation in them not being prepared to consent in year one, just to see the reaction of the press and the industry? But again, as you apply different lenses, very different data sets begin to appear. I'm right now sharing this at the country level. I'll share this at the company level, and hopefully you'll then start to draw comparisons and the benefits. And then last one, just so that I'm fair with all the countries, I picked registration fees, and this time Italy came on top with around 50%. So what I just shared at the aggregate level, it was pretty competitive, pretty equal spend, with Germany being on top. But then you start to apply different lenses, and very different data sets begin to appear. And again, I'll conclude by saying that this is beginning to show that you might have, from an organizational perspective, important aspects to consider in terms of very local spend or approach to spend at the country level. Next, I want to cover a countrywide analytics case, right? And I picked Germany because there's a lot of information that's been shared in the press, and I figured I'll take one of those items and play that up. So Der Spiegel around July did an analysis where they reported that around 75% of pharmaceutical manufacturers have provided the transparency data set or reported the spend, which means 25% did not. The second thing they shared was that applying the very basic calculation of number of physicians who consented versus those who did not, that number sits at around 33%, which means 66% of physicians did not consent, and their data was reported in aggregate. We did our own analysis and applying a different paradigm, and that paradigm was spend value as against number of physicians. What we have observed is that transparency in Germany is really sitting more around 7% as against 33%. And I'll share those numbers with you. Right? And so now you begin to pay attention to the challenge that the press is expressing, that the level of visibility is low. Okay? And again, I'm just sharing the numbers, the facts. You can definitely draw different conclusions. I won't challenge those at all. Okay? So here's the article, very quickly. It talked about 7,000 physicians in 2015. It talks about the fact that the total spend was around 575 million. And it talks about the fact that around 20,000 physicians consented. We applied and used our database that has full details of the spend in Germany. And it verified the actual spend was around 576 million and change, very close to what Der Spiegel said. The actual number of physicians who consented is around 20,300 and change, very, very close to what the publication said. So taking that number but applying the spend analytics, and again the criteria is simple, we are using total amount of spend for consented physicians divided by total amount of general spend. We're excluding research payments for obvious reasons. What we get is around 9%, and this is how we got those numbers, right? So we took the total spend for all the manufacturers who reported consent, that's 23 million. The total general spend reported by them was 257 million. You do the math, you end up with 9%, but I also want to call out that only 75% of manufacturers reported in Germany. So when you apply for that factor, you get around 6.7 or 7%. So that's the math that we were pointing to. And again, it is it's a nominal average, weighted average, there's absolute raw numbers of physicians, but the idea is to show that as you start to slice the data and get access to real specific numbers, sometimes they begin to tell a different story. And hopefully I made that case. And again, not challenging what's the best formula, what's the best method to use, but just asserting that as you start to evaluate your own organization's performance, having visibility and an opportunity to compare with industry, it might start to give you some interesting analytics. So last thing I want to cover, and again, this is just a quick eye chart. It's showing the percentage of consent applying the euro spend value or TOD value as the basis. And it's showing very similar to the range that we saw, even with just the absolute number of physicians who have consented. There's some that are sitting at 0, which means even if when I take the formula and apply to some physicians who have consented, they may not have had much in terms of spend, and there's some that are close to 100%. So very broad range. I have purposely made the name of the manufacturers opaque, just to give you an idea of the range of spend applying that formula. Conversely, there was a second number I asked you to pay attention to when I shared the chart originally, which was based on just the base number of consent, and that was Italy. Right? So maybe anyone who might have noticed and remembered that percentage? 65. Appreciate that. Yes. And then when you apply a different paradigm, in this case, spend value, in this case, the number actually jumps up to nearly 90%. So even though only 65% of physicians in Italy consented, those who consented actually had a higher percentage of overall spend than the ones who didn't. So in this case, the number jumped up. So again, not applying any judgment, but what I'm sharing with you is that numbers are beginning to reveal as you have access to these details and as you start to apply various semantics, some very interesting and very different assessments. The last thing is, so I'm going to skip this. I don't think I'll get any volunteers to go back to them and have this dialogue. But last thing I want to do is now bringing it home from the standpoint of the whole region, from the standpoint of country, to your organization. What does it mean for you? What value, what analysis, what insights can this help for you to drive and tease out? So I've masked the company name, but the main idea is to illustrate how data analytics can help you know the full story and gain insight, especially with respect to competitive analytics. I do want to digress for a few minutes on the fact that in the US, you have this industry data and company data now available for several years. So you'll be in that scenario, in that stage, in a year's time or so within EFPIA. So there are 2 or 3 things that are happening as organizations in the US are looking at their spend data. One is they're beginning to do year-over-year comparison, and you would be there next year. And the level of detail you have makes your comparison that much more effective. Second is they're beginning to do plan versus actual spend analysis. And third is comparative to the industry, because now you have several years of data in the industry as well, and that also starts to provide you some of those patterns. So taking this perspective real quick, again, I have limited this company's spend to just 4 countries for the use of this presentation, and I'm going to mask the name of the company. And what I'm sharing with you is this spend across the 4 countries for a single manufacturer, right? And in this case, the percentages are slightly different. This manufacturer had a higher spend in Spain, around 33%, then Germany around 29%, but generally broad, similar distribution. I won't go through many more slides. I've been alerted to 5 minutes. I'll stay within that time frame, but I'll share a couple other aspects with you with respect to looking at company level spend. The second aspect is that within the country, how is the spend distributed across various spend types varies quite interestingly and quite significantly. And again, that goes for you to evaluate if your strategy and your plans are comparative to what the spend pattern is showing. And our recommendation is to start to ingest your spend values during the year as against waiting for the end of the year, because then you have the opportunity to use some levers, some leverages in adjusting those numbers. Next, what I'll do is I'll dive into what I listed here as the top 10 physicians, top 10 organizations where this manufacturer has spent. And I'm picking up a physician, and I'm going to then look at influences within the industry that key physician might have. Right? So these are actual numbers. We picked that up from UK for Dr. Brown. This is publicly available. And what this begins to show is that 3 major manufacturers are heavily spending in building a relationship with this physician. So that's just to give you another aspect in how you might want to start looking at your spend and do an evaluation. Another similar comparative, but in this case in Italy, across healthcare organization. And again, several manufacturers having a level of relationship and spend with this healthcare organization. There are other interesting aspects around fair market value, around targeting that comes up, and that has come up in the US. I am projecting that type of analysis at some point will begin to take shape in EFPIA. That's all I had. I want to close by saying that there are a few elements around applying and building this level of analytics. One is that you begin to understand where you stand in the context of the industry with your own internal spend. It might help you evaluate the consent to various different mechanisms and vehicles, because that's a theme that I've been hearing for this year as something that's important for organizations to manage. And then lastly, this will help you understand your spend end-to-end and monitor that end-to-end. So with that, I will be happy to answer any questions you have or any comments.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Any question to address? No, so maybe it was crystal clear. One question?
I won't raise questions, but I'm very concerned about this type of analysis. It really makes me think there's a first part about a very famous book from 1953, How to Lie with Statistics. You can use numbers, construct them and squeeze them in all directions to prove what you want to prove. I'm not sure that this type of analysis will make the disclosure exercise sustainable. The second remark I want to make is that adding up some numbers doesn't make any sense. And that's also a mistake that was made by Spiegel and others, by media, where they add up number of doctors, neglecting that 40 companies can work with one doctor, one and the same doctor, and you will not necessarily see that name appearing the same way everywhere. So I'm very concerned about this. And last remark I would make is that I hope you've checked the disclaimers that were on the websites of companies when you have used their data. Because the consent does not always allow you to do this. Media could do it, and if you take it from the Spiegel, you have no problem to use it. But there are limitations to improve the rates of consent if we start doing this type of exercise.
Thank you, Mike, for the feedback. I think we hear you. So, can I quickly respond? Of course, if you want to, yes.
Certainly. So I do certainly respect the point of view, but I do want to call out that many publications have already called this out. So it's not a new idea. It has been called out in the media very vociferously that just taking absolute percentages of consent is concealing and really not meeting the overall expectation from the program, which was to provide more transparency in the monetary relationship between the industry and the physicians. And the industry is not in disagreement. There are agency and association leaders who have expressed that. And that's why they have begun to focus on level of consent. But again, that's another point of view. I don't think one point of view is better than the other.
It's not about levels of consent, it's about the analysis of what is spent, how it is spent, where it goes. All the maths you made to say, actually in Germany it's only 9 and not 29.
No, so-
Sorry, but for me,
No,
this
that's
doesn't
fair.
match
I respect that
anything of the
alternate
analysis.
opinion. I don't have a response to that. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank
And actually we've
Appreciate
done
your time.
both, and we've done both, numbers and amounts.
Thank you.